became kind of fascinated by Francis Perkins, sort of in the way that you did, the way you all mentioned to me. I heard her name kept coming up, and I was kind of shocked after a while how many things she'd been involved with and that she wasn't better known. When I first moved to Washington, D.C. as a young reporter for the Washington Post, I took a tour bus tour around the monuments. You know, I don't know if any of you have taken the tour of the Washington, D.C. in the shuttle bus. And I saw this huge building, and it was the Francis Perkins Department of Labor. And I was thrilled because I saw that Francis was with an E, so I knew it was a woman, Francis Perkins. So I was really fascinated because there's hardly any buildings in Washington, D.C. named after women. So I was always sort of listening for her. Then in the next few years, I kept hearing her name again and again and again. And I just became fascinated to know. It was like a mystery. Who was this woman, and how did she get so much done? She was a religious woman, and she felt like it was part of her principles to be as good to all human beings as she could possibly be. And when she saw the Triangle Fire and she saw all those people die in conditions that she knew were preventable, she thought, our country is not living up to its promise. It's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. We're letting people down and people are dying. That time, in fact, in 1911, it's been estimated that 1,000 people a day died in workplace accidents. And now we still have several hundred or thousand a year, but they were having a much higher death rate, much higher even than car crash rates that we have. And she knew it was fixable. She knew there were ways that scientists were looking at buildings and saying there are things that we can do to make them safer. So I think she did it. She was motivated partially out of a sense of responsibility as an American to do a better job for her people, for our people. Well, why was the need for reform? It's a good question. There's kind of a long answer to it. I'll try to be kind of fast with the answer. But the reality is, in our culture, we for a long time had a primarily agricultural culture. People lived on farms, they worked in farms. They weren't gathered in big workplaces like big factories and big office buildings and that sort of thing. Even our big cities were a lot smaller than they are now. And so, but as we started to have industrialization happen and big factories and workplaces be created where people were making record amounts of money, it became apparent that these were new kinds of workplaces that needed new kind of regulation. Unfortunately, one of the problems for businessmen is when you're in a very competitive workplace, what you want to do is you want to get workers as cheaply as possible, right? So employers typically want to try to find a way to get workers to do what they need to do for as little as possible. And that can lead to slavery, it leads to child labor, it leads to employing women in bad conditions. And in Francis Perkins' time, it led to employing a lot of immigrants who were new to the country and who didn't have a lot of rights, and children, because employers could pay them less money. So what she was dealing with was not just an immediate social problem, but a bigger economic problem. And those kinds of things can be a lot harder for cultures to deal with. So what she had to do was find ways to build consensus around fixing a problem, convince people that there were reasons to fix the problem, and come up with solutions that would work. And so that was Francis Perkins' genius. You can imagine there were a lot of businessmen that didn't want to change the rules. They liked it just the way it was. And then there were a lot of people who said, we can't change the rules because this is the economic system we have. It'll cause a lot of trouble if you change the rules. So a lot of the things had to be changed gradually, and what she did in her case is take things one at a time, and ended up over a lifetime implementing a lot of changes that made improvements in lives. Part of the reason she isn't well known is because she didn't always go around grabbing the limelight. There are some people who, when a good thing happens, they're running to the front and they're going, look at me, I did the good thing. There are some people who stay in the back and make the good thing work. make sure the good thing really happened, that make sure the rules got implemented, that people did what they needed to do, and that things got done properly. A lot of times she avoided the limelight. Her husband was mentally ill in addition, and then later her daughter became mentally ill too. So she had very real reason that she didn't want people to be examining her personal life that much. One of the problems for women in public life is that people look a lot at their personal life. They talk about their clothes, they talk about their kids, they talk about were they a good mother, they talk about were they a good daughter, all those kinds of things. She was very worried about getting too much publicity focused on her life when she had people who could be vulnerable if reporters were cruel. So that was another reason that she shunned the limelight in many ways. And then I think there's also a thing that it was so unusual for a woman to actually be doing so many things, having successes on so many fronts, that it was culturally different. It was culturally difficult for the country, for people to acknowledge who was actually exerting leadership. And so in a lot of cases, they sort of wanted to believe that the men that were in the front of the book were the only people responsible for doing the work. But you know, if they were busy legislators, they were traveling all around, they were giving public speeches, they were trying to get the votes for things to pass, they didn't have the time to do a report like this, did they? No. But in a lot of cases, and in Francis Perkins' time, it was the men on the front of the book that ended up getting a lot of the fame for what had been accomplished. And through her life, this was the case. It was so unusual back then to have a woman in a position of any power. They didn't even have a way to call her. You know, for example, should you call her Mr., Mrs.? How do you address someone who's in a position of power? And they didn't even know what title to give her. So they began to call her Madam Secretary, which was just a kind of an unusual way to use a phrase she didn't really like. But it really kind of just shows that part of what it was is that the whole thing was just so culturally awkward that people lacked even a vocabulary for expressing it. So I'd say it was that she purposely shunned the limelight to be more effective and to let the credit go on others who had the ability and the power to make things happen. That she avoided the limelight and she avoided the press. And then she was also the victim of some sexism. That it was so unusual to have a woman in that role that in a way it was easier for everyone to pretend that someone else had done it. I think she was an excellent leader. And in fact, that was one of the things that was her great genius. She was really good at finding, no one ever accomplishes anything alone, or very seldom. I suppose a hero who rescues children out of a burning school bus or something might have done it alone. But most big things that happen are done as group efforts, and people all play a role. What she became really good at was assembling really good teams, recognizing what groups of people could be put together to do good work together, recognizing their strengths and giving everyone responsibility for getting certain things done, pulling it all together in a way and providing oversight to pull it all together. And you see her do this over and over again, and Social Security is a really good example. She basically called a national conference, and she brought everyone to Washington, D.C. to talk about how best they could create Social Security. She got a panel of experts all to talk about all different ways to do it. In reality, she had already done a lot of the research herself, so she sort of knew already how they were going to do it. But by doing it, she created a public appearance and also created public buy-in, that this had been a process that had been well thought with a great number of people participating. And then the ideas that were implemented and discussed are ideas that were promoted as part of something that this committee had come up with. So it wasn't just that she had these ideas alone, and you know she had these ideas in her desk drawer from even before this, but they were ideas that she could say had been reached by consensus with a big group, and she ended up getting a whole group of supporters then all around the country who could take some responsibility for the success of the effort once it happened. So that was one of the ways that she did it. Let me ask you a question. Do any of you know anyone on Social Security?
My grandmother.
Yeah.
My grandmother.
Yeah. And do you know anyone on Social Security?
My stepsister, actually. She's
Okay.
23 with autism.
Oh, so, yes. Imagine a world where we didn't have Social Security and how important it is. The thing about Social Security is the disability program is a special program, but the thing about Social Security is people get it because they earned it. It was because they worked and they earned it. It's the way the federal government gives you a pension for the work that you did during your life. So one of the great other things about Francis Perkins is that she set up the Social Security system so well that's proceeded all these years with amazingly few scandals, and it works amazingly well for so many families. And they get it because they earned it. There were some immediate impacts, and then there were things that were longer term and emerging. Raising the minimum wage was a huge difference in people's lives. It took there's always been a big fight about minimum wage and what it should be. And as you can imagine, a lot of employers think it should always be lower, and a lot of employees think it should always be higher. Don't you agree? So there was a big fight over minimum wage, but when minimum wage was raised, and Francis Perkins was upset because not everyone got covered that she was hoping, but at least a lot of people got covered by minimum wage. A lot of people had an immediate increase in their family income. It meant they could have better food, it meant they could have better lodging, it maybe meant they could live in a house that had indoor plumbing, because back then a lot of people didn't have indoor plumbing. So these were all things that happened because of people's increase in minimum wage. Another thing that I think was really amazing that a very old man told me when I was researching the book, he was in his 90s and he had been working as a clerk in a retail store. And before we created a 40-hour work week, lots of people had to work almost limitless hours every week. And as a clerk in a retail store, he had to be there at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he left every night at 10 or 11 at night. So he was a young man, 23, but he'd already been working, 6 or 7 years at age 23. And the day they implemented the 40-hour work week, he was able to leave the office, the store that he worked, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, having put in an 8-hour day, and he could walk home in the daylight. And that was the first time in his life that he'd ended his day in the daylight. And so one of the effects was people suddenly, for the first time, had more time for leisure than they'd ever had. And that was a huge change in people's standard of living. Social Security also made a huge difference. That phased in a little bit because remember at that time hardly anybody had earned Social Security yet because you have to pay in. But pretty soon some people started to be able to get at least a small amount of money. And then what that meant is that even the poorest person who was working, who had earned some Social Security, would start to have some income of their own in their old age. And that really made a big difference. I had grandparents who owned a restaurant, and they had done okay some years, but not okay in other years. And then a flood took out their restaurant and destroyed it. They lived near Pittsburgh. When they got into their old age, they found themselves with nothing. They worked in their 70s for about a decade for a business that their nephew owned. And with that, they earned Social Security. And because of that, in their very oldest age, when they lived with my mother's grandparents, they had their own little income that came in. That meant that my mother's grandfather had, some money to, take the kids for a drink or go out or have a little pocket money of his own when he was basically having to live with his grandchildren because they had no money in their old age. So it meant a kind of a liberation and opening up. In the past, old age was considered a time of horror and drudgery, poverty, even starvation. And it meant that we could start to view their old years as an opportunity for them to have some leisure, some enjoyment, a little bit of free time, and then to do things in a lot of cases that make life better for other people because they have the leisure to do it. Yes, that is. And actually it's really interesting because he had been the head of the Labor Commission in the state of Maryland. So he actually held the same job in the state of Maryland that Francis Perkins held in the state of New York. And now he's gone on to become Secretary of Labor, which was the same job that Francis Perkins had when she was in the government. So it's really telling that he's obviously seeing her as a kind of a role model. And it would be a really good thing to write him a letter and thank him for what he's trying to do, because I'm sure there's a lot of people that criticize it. Even today around the country we have a big fight going on about minimum wage and how much do people need to live. And that's one of the issues that the Secretary of Labor is on the forefront of. Well, I think one of the things that she would do is talk about the fact that we had child labor here, and we had to implement things gradually to get children to be able to go to school and get educated, to do projects like you guys are doing, to learn a lot of things to make the world a better place, you know. And I think because the United States has been richer than a lot of the country, a lot of the world, a lot of people in other countries say it's easy for you to talk about us giving up child labor. You don't know how hard it is. The fact is, we do know how hard it is, don't we? We had to fight to get rid of child labor, and we had to convince people, and we had to change laws, and we had to find ways to make that happen. I think what she'd do is be talking around the world about the ways that we did it, and try to get them to try to implement some of those things too. And I think she would also do the job of showing them with pictures the faces of the children when they're working and when they're not in school. I think that's one of the things that would be most compelling. So somebody would go out and take pictures of children working and show people what that really looks like. It's not right. It's not right. When children are small, you know, it can even hurt their bodies if they're working too young. They can hurt their hands, they can hurt their arms, they get old too soon. And they get exposed to some of the, you know, the ways I showed you that were toxic fumes in the workplace. Little kids are being exposed to that in places around the world. So I think that's what she'd be doing, and so I think there's some work for you guys to do. Well, that's really good. Well, she had very strong feelings about welfare and Social Security. She was a big supporter of the welfare system, which they called aid to AFDC, aid to families with dependent children. And she was a great believer that welfare was a really good way to help mothers who needed help and financial support so they could be mothers and take care of their children. In her day, there weren't as many jobs that a woman could do that could earn good money. Even now, there aren't that many ways that a lot of women can earn very good money. So she was a great believer in that you needed to provide some financial support to people when they were trying to take care of little kids. That it's such a big job to be a mother, that it's a good thing to be able to help a woman while she's taking care of children. We've had a debate over that issue over the decades, over what the right thing is to do about that. But one of the things that she believed is that it was good for mothers to be able to have some support while they took care of children. Social Security is another thorny issue that there's been a lot of different opinions on. When Francis Perkins was alive, 65 was kind of the age at which most people really got sick and started to die. So when she originally thought of Social Security, 65 was kind of like an old age. And so when she would say to people that their Social Security would start at 65, lots of times people would laugh because they'd say, yeah, if we're so lucky to make it to 65, then we'll get Social Security. Well, you know, what's happened is because of advances in medicine, because of the fact that we're not being exposed to as many fumes, because we're not working with as much backbreaking labor from our early childhood years, we're living longer. We're living a lot longer. Who's the oldest person you know?
My great-grandmother.
And how old is she?
90.
90. Is she on Social Security?
Yes.
Well, you see, that's the thing. A lot of people are working longer on Social Security and living longer and getting Social Security longer. So there's a debate over whether we should find ways to change the program. My belief is that you can make changes in the way that you do it so that it's phased in over people's entire lifetimes and they can be prepared for that. I think everybody should be paying in. Even if they make more money, they can pay more money into Social Security. And I also think we need to be sensible and truthful in looking at the program, making changes that are needed to be made if there's a question of financial stability. On the other hand, I think it's essential that we always explain to everybody that this is a universal program that is here for everyone and that will be here for everyone. We have to have faith in the system and not doubt it, but we have to do the things to ensure that it is a safe, secure system so that we can all live to be 90 and still be getting Social Security just like your grandmother. Well, Francis Perkins had known FDR for 20 years when he was elected president, and she had worked with him in Albany, so he knew her really well. So I think he kind of assumed that she would go with him to Washington and help him like she'd been doing in Albany already. But she was really afraid. She was afraid of how difficult it was going to be working in Washington. You know, politicians' lives are in a fishbowl. People will criticize them. She knew it was going to be hard. She was worried that the health problems of her husband might get exposed in a cruel way in the press. So she was very nervous about becoming Secretary of Labor. But she was very close to her grandmother when she was little. And her grandmother had always said, when a door opens to you, you have no choice but to go through it. And she felt like when FDR asked her to be a Secretary of Labor, that she had a unique opportunity to do something that could really improve the lives of a lot of people. So she, when FDR asked her to come and talk, I think she probably had an inkling of what he was going to ask her, which was to be Secretary of Labor. So she made up a little list, and it had 10 items on it, and a lot of them are the things that we've talked about today. Ban on child labor, 40-hour work week, Social Security, unemployment insurance, a better employment service. These are some of the things that she had on her list. And when she went in and he asked her to be his Secretary of Labor, she said, "I'll only do it if you'll allow me to do these things." And he kind of laughed because the list was so audacious and it was going to be so difficult to achieve even one of those things. But he told her, "Okay, if you think you can, I'll back you." And she agreed to be his Secretary of Labor. So she went in thinking, I've been given an opportunity to do great things. I'm an American and I believe that I have a responsibility to do good things for my people. But I need to know that the president is going to back me when I try to do it. So she approached this in a very careful, cautious, and methodical way. Then she kept in her drawer of her desk, the whole time she was Secretary of Labor, this list with the things that she had said she was going to do. And each thing and she'd pull it out and she'd look at it, and every time she got one thing done, she'd sort of cross it off in her mind that she'd gotten something done on that front. So it was very methodical how she got it done. Last month I was at Mount Holyoke and I gave a talk to the 50th reunion. So they were people who had graduated from the class of 65.
Wow.
And they were the last class that graduated during the year that she was still living. And some of them even remembered having seen her,
Wow.
not met her, but seen her when she was very old. So they were very interested to hear. But yeah, the Mount Holyoke was an unusual school. It was started in the early 1800s, and really the idea of it was to take young people, particularly young women who didn't have a lot of opportunities for education at that time, and help prepare them to do things that would make the world a better place. So Mount Holyoke was one of those schools that was established as a training ground for people like Francis Perkins who were idealistic and who wanted to do things. So really from a very early age, she felt like she got educated in these issues. In fact, when she was 20, the girls at Mount Holyoke all went together to a factory. To see a factory, they had to go in a carriage, a horse and carriage back then. And they went to factories to see people working. So really, when she was even like 20 years old, she was already thinking about the problems of working people and bad working conditions. And so a lot of what happened to her, what she was able to achieve, she built on the foundation of the social service mission that was a key concept behind Mount Holyoke. And she was a very faithful alumni of Mount Holyoke and went back regularly over the whole rest of her life. And a lot of the women who went to Mount Holyoke then and now feel like they're trying to walk in Francis Perkins' footsteps. What is your name again?
Awesome. All right, so we're gonna just do one more shot. Hold it for 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. Now do your eyes. 4, 3. Francis Perkins.
We're figuring out where the author lives because we have no idea. We're going to interview Kirstin Downey, and she's famous.
Why is she famous?
Because she like wrote this boss book about Francis Perkins.
For real?